The term Scrum is borrowed from the game of rugby, where a scrum is a formation of players or a huddle. Scrum is a framework based on short cycles called sprints that typically range from 1 to 4 weeks in length. It is based on an experiential approach where the Scrum team learns by doing, testing, and reflecting. The goals of the series of short cycles is to create a product or service that brings value to stakeholders. Stakeholders are usually clients who pay for the development, other parts of the organization, or end users. The events during a sprint. Work in Scrum is done in sprints, which can be seen as short projects or cycles. A sprint is a period of time during which the Scrum team works on a part of a project or service. A sprint can be no longer than a month in time, and a new sprint starts directly at the end of the previous one. If sprints are too long, the goal of the sprint, called the sprint goal, may become invalid. Shorter sprints can be used to generate more learning cycles and limit risks of cost and effort to a shorter time frame. Apart from the actual regular development work, a sprint contains 4 events or parts. Sprint planning. When? Once at the start of a sprint. How long? Can take a maximum of 8 hours for a month-long sprint. For shorter sprints, the sprint planning is usually shorter. The sprint planning is a collaborative effort by the whole Scrum team that lays out the work to be performed during the sprint by creating a sprint backlog. The sprint planning answers 3 questions whose answers are documented in the sprint backlog. 1. Why is this sprint valuable to stakeholders? The answer becomes the goal for this sprint, called the sprint goal. 2. What items from the product backlog can be done in this sprint? By discussing with the product owner, the developers select items to include in this sprint. Items may be refined during this step to increase understanding and confidence. As the team completes more sprints or cycles, through an experiential approach, they will become better at estimating what can be done during a sprint. 3. How will the chosen work get done? For each selected product backlog item, the developers plan the work necessary to create a valuable increment that meets the definition of done. This often happens by breaking down product backlog items into smaller chunks of work of 1 day or less. Daily Scrum. When? Once every day during a sprint. How long? 15 minutes. This meeting is preferably done standing up to help keep focus and meetings short and effective. The developers look at the progress toward the sprint goal and adjust the planned upcoming work in the sprint backlog as necessary. If the product owner or Scrum Master are also actively working on items in the sprint backlog, they participate as developers. Focus is on progress toward the sprint goal and an actionable plan for the next day of work until the next daily Scrum. The daily Scrums improve communication, identify obstacles, and promote quick decision making. Sprint review. When? Once at the end of a sprint. How long? A maximum of 4 hours for a month-long sprint. For shorter sprints, it's usually shorter. The Scrum team and key stakeholders review what was accomplished during the sprint and what has changed in their environment. Based on this, they collaborate on what to do next and may adjust the product backlog to meet new opportunities. This is a working session. The Scrum team should avoid limiting it to a presentation. Sprint Retrospective. When? Once at the end of a sprint, after the sprint review. How long? A maximum of 3 hours for a 1-month sprint. For shorter sprints, it can be shorter. The purpose of this meeting is to plan ways to increase quality and effectiveness. The Scrum team looks at how the last sprint went when it comes to individuals, interactions, processes, tools, and the definition of done. The team discusses what went well during the sprint, what problems were encountered, and how those problems were solved or not. The team identifies the most helpful changes to improve its effectiveness, and the most impactful ones are addressed as soon as possible, including potentially adding them to the sprint backlog for the next sprint. 3 additional components of a sprint. In addition, there are 3 key components of Scrum that affect the work of a sprint. Sometimes they are referred to as 3 artifacts that represent work or value. Product Backlog contains a product goal which describes the future state of the product or service to be created. The rest of the product backlog is a dynamic, emerging, and ordered list of what needs to happen to fulfill the product goal. User stories can be included here. Sprint Backlog. This is created during the sprint planning and contains the sprint goal. This states why this particular sprint is valuable to stakeholders. Selected product backlog items. These are the items the Scrum team selects to work on during this particular sprint. An actionable plan. This is a plan for fulfilling the sprint goal, working on the selected product backlog items and delivering 1 or more increments at the end of the sprint. Increment. An increment is a concrete stepping stone toward the product goal. Each increment adds to the previous increments and is verified to work together with them. In order to provide value, the increment must also be usable. Another important definition. Scrum uses a term called the definition of done. This is a formal description of what state something created during a sprint needs to be in to meet the quality measures required for the product. The moment a product backlog item meets the definition of done, an increment is created.